gender childbearing make us more conservative or made us adopt values or attitudes that are more consistent with traditional gender norms, in particular traditional distribution of household activities and work. So to be honest, this is not the first paper that we have seen in this area. This is an area that it is growing slowly but continuously. So we have very rich literature telling us about how belief on gender roles affects the gender wage gaps, and this has been checked around the world. I forgot here to include perhaps Seguino's paper from 2009. But as you can see, this is a literature that it is still very much active. I guess the most famous here is the paper by Kleven, when they are looking at the child penalty, and they are trying to, they are looking at the child penalty across 7 or 8 countries. And what they found is that, well, basically these child penalties are larger when the gender roles are more traditional. So when there are more acceptance of traditional gender roles. Now, this is one of the things that kind of made me think about exploring this a little bit further. Also, we have seen a lot of literature that, and some of the people who are present here have contributed to this literature, showing how important the children penalty is. And we have from the very early analysis of Velde, who was not precisely looking at the child penalty, but he was basically telling us how expectations about child penalty could influence selection into occupations, to more recent meta-analysis where they have developed, where they have shown how important these penalties can be. And of course, again, Kleven is a must among these references for their impressive work on Denmark. Now, the thing that it is important to me here is that even though most of these assume that beliefs are stable within a country, so you can kind of sort the country so that you have more or less equal countries, the thing is that these beliefs about what are acceptable gender roles, they are not stable over time, not only across countries, but even at the individual levels, there is some evidence that this evolves. Now, these are like a few papers that I could find. As you can see, this is still something that is very recent. We have the Border reporter who is telling us about how men change their attitude around childbirth, particularly after they father a daughter. Other papers from Princeton and from England who are also telling us that there are some changes going on in terms of what do people believe to be adequate gender norms, right? Now, one possible explanation for why these beliefs are not stable is given by cognitive dissonance, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about this in the next slide. Now, this literature is still starting, so I think speaking about shortcomings is kind of an exaggeration, but these are things where we can still contribute, where I see my paper building on the literature. So most of the previous analyses have focused on 1 or 2 countries. So all these that we have seen here, this report, Kushemko, Barrington, and Cunningham, they are mostly working with English data from Great Britain or with data from the United States. Now, this is a very specific set of countries with a very specific set of institutions and ways to regulate childcare and access to maternity leaves and so on. So the second part is that most of these papers are looking at either what happens to men or what happens to women, mostly women, and few of them actually focus on both of these groups at the same time. This is something that I will be doing later today. And there is not much in terms of what can explain these attitudes, or rather what can explain these changes in the attitudes. So how are we going to contribute to this? Our main hypothesis, we're going to follow the lead of Kushemko et al. I think he was also Jessica Pan as one of the co-authors in this et al. What they propose is that the birth was actually an information shock. So before the childbirth, people were not fully aware of how much additional effort it requires for men and for women. In many cases, it's going to be mostly for women to combine work, and household activities. Now, the way that they analyze it is they are looking at educational decisions, and they are trying to see if these educational decisions are rational or if they are consistent with this model. So they get over-educated. Now, if we try to put it in kind of in a causal kind of framework, this is kind of the idea that I had in mind when I started working in this project. So you have some prior attitudes which are not drawn here, but it will be to the left of this childbirth. Then you have the childbirth. Childbirth provides some anticipated difficulties in work-life balance, and this is the part where this information shock would come here, and this is the interpretation of childbirth as an information shock. Now, because you are facing some difficulties in combining work and life balance, some of the things that you believed to be possible before might have changed, or rather, the way in which you express your attitudes changes in order to avoid this cognitive dissonance. Now, cognitive dissonance, this is from Cranston et al. And Akerlof as well, where they are trying to introduce your own identity as an element in the utility function. So what they are basically proposing is that in the face of cognitive dissonance, your identity might be changing. And the way in which this identity could change is towards the adoption of more or the expression of more traditional values. Now, what are we going to do, or how am I going to try to work on this on this framework? Most of what I'm going to show today is the first step in this procedure, which is to estimate the relation between the birth of the first child and the attitude. So we are not going to look at directly at the middle steps here. So these anticipated difficulties and this cognitive dissonance. We're going to just relate your expression of attitudes towards different gender norms to whether you have become a parent, right? Now, next, what I would like to do, and I have actually started, and I have some big results on this, is to explore heterogeneity across countries and groups of countries. And the next step, which will be coming in the next iterations of the paper, is relating these heterogeneous effects that I'm going to show today to labor market institutions and to care institutions and to models of care. Now, for this, let's go to the data program, to the data method parts. I'm going to use the gender generation survey. I understand that some of you have contributed to this database. This is, I also find the name gender generation program in some places. Anyway, this is a joint database that was collected by national institutions, but it was under the auspices or coordinated by the Economic Commission for Europe of the United Nations, and now the Dutch Institute for Demographic Studies. This is this NIDI. Now, in Poland, it was collected by my home university now, that is by SEH. Now, in most cases, most of the data points were collected between 2002 and 2014. They have different starting dates for different countries. Usually, we have 2 waves per country. This is the ones that we are able to use. And each wave is spaced by around 3 to 5 years, again, depending on the country. I think in the case of Poland, it was 2010 and 2014. So Poland was one of the last countries to join this effort. And this is important because this is going to allow us to identify the time between the survey and the time where you have the first kid. Now, overall, the country coverage, as you can see, it covers around 20 countries. And even though it's mostly focused on European countries, there are some from Asia as well. So we have Oceania. So we also have here Australia and Japan. Now, unfortunately, not all of these countries have 2 waves. For some of them, it is only 1. And since our identification is going to be a Diff-in-diff approach, we are going to restrict our analysis to those countries for which we have 2 waves. Now, these are the countries in red. These are the countries for which we observed 2 points in time. Now I have to further restrict because some of these countries didn't ask questions concerning gender norms on both waves. So this also leaves outside 2 additional countries, and these 2 additional countries are Italy and the Netherlands. So our final sample is going to be consistent of these 9-10 countries. Most of them, as you can see, are going to be from Central and Eastern Europe. The only exceptions will be, of course, France, Germany, and Austria. And as we will see later on, the results for these countries are slightly different, not for the rest. One more word of advice. Not all of the countries collected the same list of variables, right? So I'm going to inform you when some of the countries drop from the sample because they haven't asked a particular question. Now, why this GGS? Well, first, because it's a very rich database which has this focus on fertility, so we can time the birth, we can distinguish between step adopted kids and their own kids. In practice, we are going to focus on their own kids, and we are going to leave step kids and adopted kids aside for the moment. This doesn't result in a much significant drop in the sample because these are relatively small populations. We also like it that it has relatively large sample size. So in most countries, it has around 10K observations. Of course, because we are looking at a very specific and a very narrow subpopulation, we are going to be using a slightly smaller sample. And I also like this wide country coverage that is going to be useful later on. So this is what we are actually going to take from the gender and generation survey. So we're going to respond and we're going to focus on those individuals for which we have longitudinal data, that is those who appear in the 2 waves. Depending on the country, attrition is going to change. In some of them it's going to be very strong, in others it's going to be much less of an issue. We are also focusing on people who are childless. This is because, well, I believe that if it is truly an informational shock that matters, then you would expect this informational shock to be stronger in the case of the first child that you're fathering and not in the case of subsequent children. So that's why we are going to focus on those respondents who are childless on the first wave. And finally, just we're going to restrict the sample to those people who are between 20 and 35. This is because this is most likely the ages at which people have kids in Europe. So you wouldn't expect them to have kids at the ages of the first kid after the age of 40. Of course, this could happen, but it would make it the comparisons much less suitable. Now, how much do these restrictions bite? Well, as you can see, if we start from the very beginning, so if we take all of the people who are in the all of the people who are in this GGS, it's around 100,000 observations. But as we move further and we keep imposing restrictions, we end up with around 11,000 observations. So around 10% of the sample are childless aged 20 to 35 and can be observed in both waves. Now, what does it mean as well? That if we have 10 countries, then we have around 1,000 observations per country. In some cases, we're going to have more. I think Poland is one of the examples where we have almost 2,000, and in some other countries, we're going to have less. But this is just to give an idea of how our sample looks like. So to measure the agreement with traditional gender norms, I kind of split it for the presentation, these norms in 2 domains. First, how important the family is, and second, how important the labor market is. Now, in the case of the role of the family, I will be using 3 variables. Women require a child to be fulfilled. This has been used several times before. Men require a child to be fulfilled. This is a variable that I found only in GGS. So there is not possible to compare it with the previous literature. And the last one is whether the kid suffers if the mother is working before in preschool kid suffers. I think there is nothing controversial here. In the case of women in the labor market, we're going to focus on 4 variables. And please remember the numbers, because as we move on to the presentation, we are going to refer to this as outcome 1, 2, 3. So not, yeah, that's a little bit difficult. But I trust that a bunch of PhD professors can do that, and candidates, of course. So these conditions for women in the labor market, if jobs are scarce, men have priority. The second is about relative earnings. This is important in the light of this paper that shows that women who are earning more are acting more housewife. The last one, so the next to the last one is about gender norms in the household. So just whether being a housemaker is just as fulfilling as working for a job. And the last is just for the comparison against the first one. So the first one is just men have priority, but perhaps this is more informative. That is, people with children have more right to work than childless couples. Now, as you can see, most of these outcomes have been used before by the literature, and including here Seguino and Steinhauer. And our results are going to be, to some extent, comparable to those of Steinhauer. The only new variables that have not been looked before is men require a child to be fulfilled, which tells us about the importance of the family for men, relative earnings, and the relative importance of being a parent for kid, right? for job priority. Now, as I said, the model that I'm going to estimate is just, I'm going to use a Diff-in-diff estimation. So I'm going to estimate linear probability models where the dependent variable is the probability that you are going to agree or strongly agree with any of the statements that we have said before. The parents is a dummy variable against CO1 that takes the value of 1 if you are a parent or if you would be a parent. So if you become a parent between the 2 waves, this variable here is going to take the value of 1. After indicates the survey wave. By definition, for parents, this is the period after the given birth. And xi is other variables which are measured at the time of the first survey, marital status, so whether a person is married or not. And this is formal unions only. Education, age, country of residence, and so on. Now, the coefficient that I care about is beta 3. Now, beta 3, in this setup, it would be possible to identify with the causal effect of childbirth on action. This is the interpretation that I want to provide. And given what we have talked about the cognitive dissonance, if women indeed adopt or men adopt more conservative or more traditional views after childbirth, we would expect beta 3 to be positive. Now, there are issues to identification here because, as you can imagine, becoming a parent is not something that occurs randomly, but there is an issue of self-selection. So the way that we deal with this is, well, first we include some fixed effects. So if we believe that this is driven by some unobserved heterogeneity, which is time constant, then including fixed effects in the regression 1 that I showed you a moment ago should deal with this issue. The problem with including fixed effects is that it does not allow to control for other characteristics which are time invariant between the 2 groups. So on top of that, I'm also using propensity score matching, in particular the method developed by the covariant balancing propensity scores developed by Imai and Ratkovich, to balance the samples of parents, that is would-be parents, and childless respondents. So this is kind of to address the self-selection into motherhood. The second kind of assumption that we are making always when we are doing this Diff-in-diff type of analysis is that there are no pre-trends. Now, testing for pre-trends is kind of cumbersome in this case, because we have 2 groups where it is not very clear what the pre and the post is. So in particular, for the case of people who are not parents in the first wave and they are not parents in the second wave, what is exactly the post? So we're going to just show that in this group, there are mostly no significant differences in the proportion of people that supports a given statement in the first survey and in the second survey. Now, for the people who are parents, well, we would expect that we cannot use the same approach. Well, basically because our hypothesis tells us that there is something going on and that something is going to occur, which is what we want to show. So instead of that, I'm going to estimate a specification that looks a little bit like a regression discontinuity design, where the discontinuity is set at childbirth. Now, this discontinuity, you have here the probability that you agree with the statement conditional on being a parent. And what we're going to test is all the parameters theta2. So I'm going to estimate this regression. I have here a polynomial on time, and I'm going to run f-test to see if this theta2 is, if these parameters in the theta2 vector are significant or not. Now, I am aware that both tests are in a certain sense weak, right? Because the most that I can do with this test is show that that there is no evidence to reject the null hypothesis of no preterms, which is not the same thing as corroborating that indeed there are no preterms. So with this caveat in mind, I think we can proceed. So these are the descriptive statistics. Let's start with the results. I divided here in 4 columns. The tables here indicate whether it is, so the columns indicate whether which wave they come from and whether you are a parent or not, and we can, or a would-be parent or not. And we see that, yeah, there are differences between the two groups, as we would have expected. Now, these differences are mostly, or are to a large extent, derived from perhaps this crucial difference in age, because this might be the age at which a lot of people are finishing their tertiary studies and are entering into the labor market. So just from the fact that they are a little bit younger, we can of course expect that it's going to be more with completed secondary and fewer with completed tertiary, and that there is going to be more people who are inactive. Now, in the second part, so in the wave 2, when they are both a little bit older, those who were younger before almost surely completed the tertiary studies, we see that there are still some differences in terms of education, but these differences are statistically significant, yes, but there are just a few percentage point differences, so they are not that large. Now let's go into the results. This is just a comparison of proportions that I have done for the two groups. So these are the different outcomes. So I'm going list of outcomes so we can go back and we can check them, because this could be a little bit of an issue. So we have wave 1, wave 2, parents and non-parents. And what are the important things here? First, as we expected, parents are different from, would-be parents are different from parents. So this is the self-selection into parenthood that I have spoken a moment ago. In the case of mothers, you can see that the answer to whether a kid is required to feel fulfilled in life is much higher for people who would like to, who will eventually become parents. Now, this is expected, right? So people who want to have kids end up having kids. And the difference appears to be growing, so it's around 4 percentage points higher in the after period, but this is not statistically significant. So personally, they also are more likely to agree with that fathers also require a child to be fulfilled.
I'm sorry, Lucas, for clarification. So
Yeah.
before is the before becoming a parent, or it is the first wave, second wave? And the yes, no?
Yeah. So
You said it, but I got lost and now.
No, it's okay. I understand that the labels were, I changed the labels in between tables and this can be a little bit confusing. So before and after is before and after childbirth, which in our case is the same thing as wave 1 and wave 2, because we kept only those respondents who were childless in wave 1, right? But of course, this is not well defined for people who are childless over the entire period. So I guess the question is justified. And Y and N stands for yes, they would become a parent, and no, they will not become parents. Okay. And the same here. So these are people who already became parents, and these are those respondents who are still childless. Now, as I said, there are cases in which there were differences that existed before, right? But there are some other instances where the differences are not there before, but are there after. And this is a variable that, so this is the variable on whether parents should have priority for jobs. And as you can see, in the case of people who are childless, this doesn't change. And for those who become parents, there has been a significant increasing in the proportion. But also, this 1 versus 3, so we are comparing people who are parent before and after, and you see that there is a significant change. In this case, it would seem to move in the opposite direction to what we initially expected. Now, take, of course, into account that we are not controlling for the different characteristics of the respondents. The differences that you can see here at the very right of the table, these are driven by the fact that different countries selected different questions, and we have, of course, some missing answers. So some people refuse to answer one of these questions. These observations where an individual refuses to answer the question in at least one period are, of course, dropped from the sample. Not that it would matter given our difference in difference approach. Importantly, there seems to be very little here going on in terms of parents before and after. As I said, here in the case of whether you need a kid to be fulfilled, there seems to be a decrease in the support for this option, but this decrease is lower than 1 percentage point. So I'm kind of confident that there are no pretrends in the case of mothers. And I'm even more confident that there are no pretrends in the case of fathers. And this is this last column 2 before, right? So before and after, parents, fathers do not change their opinion on anything, right? Or they didn't change their opinion, at least in changes in the opinions are not statistically significant, the 10% level. Now, let's go to the main results here. And as I said, this is the regression that I'm going to after the session go to the paper and see them. Okay, I have this. We have here our 3 specifications. The first is the initial Diff-in-diff. The second is the Diff-in-diff where I add fixed effects for the respondent. And the third is the Diff-in-diff plus the fixed effects for the respondent, plus the propensity score matching to balance the control and to balance characteristics between parents and non-parents. Now, as you can see here, we see that there is a huge increase, so 5 percentage point increase on the probability that the woman is going to that a female respondent is going to say that women actually require a child to be fulfilled after giving birth. We see nothing in the case of men. Now, perhaps what it is interesting is that if we ask men require a child to be fulfilled, we see the exact mirror image. So very small changes in the case of women, mostly significant changes. And again, we're looking at the same kind of size. So we are still looking at 5 percentage point increase in the probability that we are going to agree with this. Now, women also appear to be to say that it is also important for their partners, right? Which is something I really didn't see before. The third that we have said is preschool child suffer if the mother works. This doesn't seem to be an opinion shared by many women, but this seems to be an opinion which is shared by many men. So why is this important? Well, I would relate mostly to the third one here. So to some extent, there appears to be a relation that men appear to be embracing more gender roles. Now, this is against the findings of Borrell Porta. So they were saying that there was a mighty girl. I understand that they were looking only at one gender, and most of the facts come from the third, 4th year after birth. But even then, for us to have this result here, if there is a change which is negative in the case of those who are fathering a girl, it must be like really strong for those who are fathering a boy. And I see no reason for this to happen. Now, if we move to the work realm, I guess this is one of the most important outcomes, which is this about job scarcity and men having more right. We see that there is a significant effect, but this effect is only visible in the case of women. Now, this is a almost 5%, 4.5 percentage case of around 0.18% of people who were agreeing with that. So this is almost 20% increase with respect to the baseline. Now, this is, to my understanding, a very large effect, and might be speaking of this cognitive dissonance. If we look at other characteristics, earnings inside the household, there seems to be nothing. Effects are very small. In the case of women, there are negative, but still not precisely estimated in the case of men. So being a housemaker is just fulfilling working for pay. Like, the question is being a housewife, but still, we don't see anything. If something, again, we are finding some evidence in the case of men that point estimates are talking against this mighty girl hypothesis for the reasons that we have said before. And yeah, when jobs are scarce, the parents have priority over childless people. We were expecting this result to occur. So we have effects which are slightly higher. Now, this, to me, this speaks a little bit about corporative attitude. So if we look at the woman and the work realm, we find very little evidence on men changing their attitudes concerning what are the activities that correspond to women when it comes to work. So they don't seem to be an increasing preference for men or differences in earnings. There is some evidence that women tend to become more conservative, but it is hard to disentangle this from the fact that they are adjusting to the new role. So they believe perhaps that parents should have priority, and if in their households they are not the earning parent, they might translate this, they might interpret these two questions about men having priority and parents having a priority in the same way. Now, this would also imply that they are internalizing more the role of the male breadwinner model. Now, as I said, one of the conditions for us to interpret this beta-3 in a causal way is to look at pre-trends. Now, I have here the probability of agrees conditional of being a parent. This is our pseudo RDD specification. And what I show here in the table are the values of an F-test for all the coefficients on theta2. In the case of linear, this is just one coefficient. Quadratic, this is time on the square. Cubic is, of course, a cubic polynomial. Now, for the values that we have interpreted, you can see that there is not much going on in the case of women. Any significant effect, right? So, as I said, this is not showing that there are no pre-trends, but this is increasing our confidence that this might be the case. So we are failing to reject this null hypothesis. Now, having done that and seeing that I'm running a little bit out of time, I will just to present the results. So this is something that I've been preparing today. So I'm still working on this. This is the heterogeneity analysis. I'm going to split the outcomes between Central and Eastern European countries and non-Central and Eastern European countries. And what you can see is that the results are mostly driven by what's going on in Central and Eastern Europe. So on the one hand, this makes sense because this is where most of the observations are coming from. I remind you that we had 7 countries here. We only had 3 in the second. But still, it seems to be mostly going on this side, both for women and for men. Importantly, the coefficient that we have seen before about whether the kid suffers when the preschool kid suffers when the mother works, the no effect that we have seen was actually a combination of 2 things. So some effect that we observe in the Central and Eastern European countries, and the lack of an effect in the rest, in the other 3 kind of Western European countries. If we look also at when jobs being a little bit more scarce, if men should have a priority, again, the outcome was driven mostly by women in Central and Eastern European countries. We don't seem to find any effect in the case of in the other 3 countries. Now, this is kind of surprising, and this is the reason why I thought about that the next logical step would be to try to connect the results here, try to obtain results at the country level, with the difficulty that the sample sizes are going to be much smaller, and these results are going to be less precisely estimated, to labor market and care institutions. Perhaps to highlight is this single negative outcome, because this is the only one that speaks about fathers abandoning their traditional gender attitudes. Now, to be honest, not all countries are different. So you have very large effects in Lithuania and very small effects in Poland. So I try to do this. What is the problem? The main problem is that the point estimates are not precisely estimated. I would like to continue trying to explore this avenue, but with very small sample sizes. As I said, most of them are below 1,000, and a very demanding specification in terms of standard errors. Finding more precise estimates is not very easy. Again, looking at point estimates, the non-CE countries are also not born equal. So as we expected, there is a divide between, as we expected from Stenhauer, right? There is a divide between France on the one side, Germany and Austria on the other, where Germany and Austria are more conservative, and the women and men in these countries tend to adopt more conservative attitudes after childbirth. With the caveat that these are less precisely estimated estimates. So as I said, and this is my last slide. So the results, we're trying to look at the child gap by looking how having children affects other outcomes, and perhaps by looking at indirect effects. So instead of just regressing one on the other, trying to understand a little bit about the mechanisms, and the mechanism proposed here is this of changes in the attitudes. So we do find some cases with these attitudes change. We find that this is more important in the case of Central and Eastern European countries than in the case of Western European countries. And that when they do change, they mostly change towards towards agreeing with more traditional gender norms. So I have it as next steps. Try to relate this to labor market or care institutions. Try to consider other heterogeneity tests, because I think I haven't explored to the maximum the possibilities of gender and generation survey. They have a question on fertility intentions that could provide an even more, an even clearer answer to the question that I have asked here. And of course, I would like to link this to observable outcomes and not just answers. So I would like to link this to changes in household responsibilities, and labor market status, and so on. But for this, we would require a little bit more time, and this is something that I'm going to work on.